Hey everyone, this is James from Ring Books. So today I wanted to talk about something different. Most of you following this channel know about my love for Tolkien and his works. The books, the films, fantasy, English literature in general, reading, writing, and all of that. But where did it start from? And I wanted to share with you this journey which started 22 years ago. So let's wind the clocks back to 2002. I was a 13-year-old, very much interested in history, but admittedly I did not enjoy fantasy, at all. And this was especially true for films, fantasy films. The very idea of a monster in some weird prosthetic costume, whilst in the background there's this blaring old-style musical score, honestly made me feel uninterested and also uneasy. There was something about the whole genre that put me off and didn't appeal to me. It felt too surreal and distanced from the real world in which we live. I'll be honest, however, and admit that I did enjoy the occasional fantasy-oriented TV show, such as Xena, the Warrior Princess, or The Adventures of Hercules. Come to think of it, I actually really enjoyed watching them. And so it was not the best of times on this particular day in March in 2002, when I was dragged by my family to go and watch this incredibly praised film by the name of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Over the Christmas period 2 months prior, everyone was talking about this one film, and also Harry Potter, which virtually became the talk of the town. And honestly, I wasn't even aware of a novel which existed on which these films were based. And I was completely oblivious to the story, except for 2 specific images which came to mind whenever someone mentioned The Lord of the Rings. This and this. And it's actually interesting that I went to see The Fellowship of the Ring in March. And in fact, it was one of those things which initially struck me, because I kept thinking, how on earth could this still be playing in theaters when it was released before Christmas? So with reluctance and some trepidation, I sat down in front of the cinema screen and waited. And the first few images of the first fantasy film I ever experienced in cinema flashed before my eyes. And these were, of course, the Fellowship's initial prologue sequence. I remember actually feeling genuinely uneasy when the close-up shots of the orcs came on screen. However, I was very much impressed by the battle scenes during the last alliance sequence. And the fact that the portrayal of large-scale battle scenes on screen was always something which fascinated me. And eventually the film progressed even further, and I actually found myself being intrigued by the narrative as it unfolded, being exposed to such varied races, and the strong sense of historical authenticity within both the environments and the characters themselves made it for a much more acceptably real fantasy, in my mind at least. And it's something which I had honestly never felt would actually be possible. So I watched the progression of the adventure of the Fellowship, which was fraught with toils and danger, but also with themes of friendship and self-sacrifice. Not to mention the mesmerizing beauty of the musical score. And in fact, I was almost reproaching myself at having disliked the fantasy genre to begin with. Anyway, the film eventually reached the climactic moments, and with the conclusion of the final intense sequence, I felt so absorbed in the characters' journeys, so intrinsically immersed in the world, that once the screen faded to black and the credits began rolling, I was honestly disappointed that I had to wait almost 2 years to see the conclusion to this story. Actually, I remember sitting in the theater seat, unable to believe my own feelings towards the film itself. And a fantasy film for that matter. I somehow kept thinking, how could a film like this be enjoyed by someone like me? And that is when, later on, I realized that what Peter Jackson did was something truly special. Needless to say, I was now looking forward to watching the continuation of the story with The Two Towers, which was only 9 months away. Mind you, I did eventually forget everything about The Lord of the Rings a few days after watching the film. But now I realize that back then I had taken the first few feeble steps in the fantasy genre without fully realizing it. Viewing the Fellowship of the Ring that day seemed to have somehow rewired my thoughts about the whole concept of fantasy. Nonetheless, I was still far away from picking up any book written by Tolkien, or any book in general for that matter. You see, back then I was one of the many kids completely uninterested in reading anything unless it was something that had to be done by force for school, whether we liked it or not. Anyway, eventually October 2002 passed by and I somehow came across the trailer for The Two Towers. And then it snapped. As I said, I had completely forgotten about The Lord of the Rings until that moment, and a surge of excitement took over as I finally realized that within a few weeks I will be seeing the continuation of the story. So day by day, week by week, month by month, we eventually approached December. Now, as the day of release finally arrived, I was naturally looking forward to this second installment and finding out what happened to all the characters I had been introduced to in the first film. This time round, my feeling as I approached the cinema theater was cautiously optimistic. I still wasn't fully a fantasy genre enthusiast, nor a complete The Lord of the Rings fan. Especially since what I could recall from the Two Towers trailer which I had seen, there was a certain screaming, squeaking pale creature with big luminous eyes by the name of Gollum, which was not an exciting prospect I was really looking forward to seeing on screen. And yet, despite the almost 3-hour-long running time, the Two Towers viewing experience passed in a flash. What struck me most was how the editing of a movie can really make or break the narrative flow. The complexities during the post-production process could only be guessed at, but the final result was a top-notch visual storytelling feast. And what were once perhaps considered as ugly-looking creatures were now perceived as fully-fledged orcs and Uruk-hai and golems. Adding to that, we were presented with a whole new array of characters, environments, settings, storylines that continued to swell the already fantastically brimmed world of Tolkien's imagination. However, it was at a particular moment in the film that really made me believe in fantasy and paved the way for where I am now talking to you on this platform. You see, it all revolved around the climax of the film, a particular sequence known as the Battle of the Hornburg, or Helm's Deep. Now, I've already expressed my love and respect for the portrayal of large-scale battles on screen. And here I was presented with something unexpected, something I never thought would occur. The only way I can describe it is like this. Have you ever felt the frustration when you're watching a battle or an action scene, which is just starting to unfold, and there's a really strong build-up to what's about to happen, when suddenly the main character is either knocked unconscious or else the day is saved by an unexpected turn of events. And just like the character, we, the audience, miss out on the entire battle or action. That disappointment is evident in many films and TV shows I have watched throughout the years, when it comes to a proper battle at least. And yet, the Two Towers seem to somehow break that curse. In all its glory, there it was on screen, and the visual spectacle was astonishing. Everything was executed beautifully. The cinematography, narrative, editing, choreography, visuals and sound effects. And suffice to say, the film ends with an eye-opener that leads us into the third and final film, which left me once again excited at the prospect of the next film and sad that I had to wait yet another 12 months before seeing it. And believe it or not, no kidding, I literally spent the whole year of 2003 avoiding people talking about anything related to The Lord of the Rings. People who had either read the book or were simply speculating about how the story was going to end. Luckily, social media was nothing compared to what it is today, of course, but even venturing online was undertaken very cautiously, in case I came across some forum or message board with spoilers. The journey I had taken over a year and a half prior had brought me into this state of incredulous anticipation, and my mind was constantly filled with visions of what was going to happen to each of the characters and how the story was going to ultimately end. In my mind, the real world, as it were, became a reflection of the Middle-earth to be in The Return of the King. Dark clouds, for instance, reminded me of the impending doom and the threat of Mordor, and they still do to this day. It was such a strong emotion. Or, for instance, a cold blast of wind from the north or the west reminded me of the hope carried on by our heroes and the characters, and their journeys in the lands of Middle-earth. The daily commute from home to school reminded me of Frodo's own journey to Mount Doom. In fact, such were the influences and strong emotions that I felt from around October to December of 2003, that any form of stormy or wintry weather reminds me of exactly that time 21 years ago. And it's still my favorite time of the year. Eventually, the big day arrived, and I found myself sitting once more inside the cinema theater in front of the screen, and I just couldn't contain my excitement. The lights were dimmed and the third film began. To say that it exceeded my expectations would be an understatement, and the entire experience was nothing short of breathtaking. The Middle-earth I had started to love was showing me more of itself for the last time, in a massive way. It literally felt like I was in that fantasy world once again, witnessing all of the events with my own eyes. The depth and the emotions were all present during those unforgettable 3 hours and 21 minutes. I had honestly never experienced a film in such a way, and the experience itself was truly powerful and life-changing. Let's also not forget the scale of the battle sequences, which increased drastically when compared to the ones in the Two Towers. The intensity and the desperation of the third act's climax was tangible, not to mention the pitch-perfect editing that raised the stakes of this story to its limits, until eventually reaching the bittersweet conclusion. But as with everything, there had to be an end. And as the credits rolled up for the last time, I couldn't help but feel somewhat sad that I was leaving Middle-earth. Sure, I would always be able to rewatch the films, but it was clear even then, as a 15-year-old, that I was never going to see that world from a new perspective, or meet the characters for the first time, or experience the awe-inspiring beauty of the vast environments for the very first time. Of course, back then I had no clue about the extended editions. It would only be some 3 years later that I would realize that I had the opportunity to experience even more of Middle-earth than I had previously experienced, a whole 2 hours worth. And as I've already mentioned, this was not really an end in itself, but rather the beginning of my appreciation and understanding of Tolkien and his works. One that, as the years went by, I found myself collecting his books and delving into every piece of text that I could find related to Middle-earth and beyond. I had finally found something worth pursuing. My first experience of reading The Lord of the Rings or anything related to Tolkien is actually a weird one. As I said earlier, and ever since I was young and was able to read, I didn't. In fact, paragraphs longer than a few lines would send my mind drifting off to something else. I just couldn't manage to concentrate on the clunky descriptions and the words for longer than a few minutes. So it was such a twist for me when almost a year later I decided to pick up a copy of the Silmarillion. I was completely naive and I thought that having seen the Lord of the Rings films, I thought I knew most, if not everything, that had to do with those stories of the Third Age. So I thought that a book exclusively on events of the First Age would be fascinating to go through and an easy read. Very, very naive. It was a struggle to read through this Silmarillion, as you are aware from some of my previous videos. And having finally completed my first reading of that book, I decided to revert back to the more familiar and popular story. So I managed to get a copy of The Two Towers, this very same one in fact, and decided to start reading this. Now I have no idea why I didn't start with The Fellowship of the Ring, but probably, as I've stated many times, I was looking forward most to read the chapters involving the Battle of Helm's Deep. And as I began reading this for the very first time, I realized that the writing style was very different from the Silmarillion, and having quite a number of mental visuals from the film, I could easily follow what was going on. However, the book went much deeper than the film, weaving together the level of detail of that world with the actions and complex motives of the characters. It really felt like I was reading and mentally visualizing a much extended and truer version of the film. My interest eventually extended beyond the battle chapters. Here was a story, at least the middle third of it, with rich characters and a believable world, with a sense of historical authenticity, one which I had already experienced in the Silmarillion. Naturally, I drifted back to the Fellowship of the Ring, reread The Two Towers and The Return of the King, and by the end of it I felt positively overwhelmed, basically by the scope of the entire book, and it left me wanting more. Eventually I got round to reading the Silmarillion second and third time, and included also The Hobbit and other books by and about Tolkien as well, as basically I branched outwards in my reading experience, as I wanted to learn and read more about the author that brought this world to life, including biographies, commentaries, and the like. And without initially realizing it, I had also developed a passion for reading and writing. And that brings me to this present day, talking to you here on this channel, which, although is about my love for reading and writing in general, has an intense focus and appreciation on Tolkien and his works. It's a passion that began on that day in March 2002, when I saw The Fellowship of the Ring, and then eventually fueled further by The Two Towers. It's a passion that hasn't dimmed in the slightest, but rather has grown even more potent. And what I have learned from both the films and the books has really impacted many aspects of my life, in a good way of course. Now, Tolkien purists may or may not agree with the films. Let's also include the Hobbit trilogy as well, but that's a discussion for another video. However, besides appreciating what they are and what they tried and managed, in my opinion, to achieve, they are the reason why I find myself here talking to you about Tolkien. And that's as philosophical as I get. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video and listening to me sharing my thoughts about how all of this began. And please do share your own stories in the comments below, as I'd really love to read about your own experiences. Somehow every time I read or hear about an individual's own story, how they became acquainted with this world, with this author and these films, I find myself revisiting my own experiences through the eyes and words of that person. And I'm sure others do and feel the same way as well. So please do share your own stories here with us, as I'd love to read them and get to know about your own experiences. So that's it for today. Thank you as always for watching this video. Like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!